And we're going to launch into this subject, but with a few comments before we start. Mind control is one of those things that people don't like to talk about, including yours truly, frankly. And, but I got into it, and I saw the evidence, and it was, there it was. Now, officially, MK-Ultra was a CIA mind control project that lasted about 10 years. Let's say from 1952 to 62, 63. Before it started, there was Artichoke and Bluebird. Those were other projects, mind control projects of the CIA. And after it ended, supposedly in 63, an office called ORD, Office of Research and Development, took it over. Now, their job, we don't know about. We're not sure of everything that they did because that information is not available. It's in 130 boxes of material somewhere, maybe in Langley, Virginia, and they won't release it. But various people have said that they employed more sophisticated measures than MK-Ultra to do mind control on people. I think one of the reasons that this is such an important subject is because we're looking at people here who have a certain attitude about life itself, and these people are in the government, and they are in important positions in the government. And in order to understand what they are really about, we get a look at them which is unprecedented by looking at what they did with this kind of experimentation on humans. In other words, they hate life. Okay? That's pretty clear. They have their own version of life, which is like death. And that's where their life is. And that's what they feed off of. And I would say that most, if not all, secret societies are based on the same concept. Once you cut through all of the paraphernalia and the symbology of secret societies, you're basically dealing with people who have, for one reason or another, given up on life completely. They are now into the form of life that is involved with death. That's their territory. And it's a pretty horrendous thing to say, but I think that it would be borne out. My own feeling is that we're talking about a confluence of different influences here on individuals that go back a long way into the past, into the families, the history of families in which they grew up. I'm talking about long-term history, what those families are, and these are people who are entirely functional but entirely psychotic, if you want to use that psychological term. It doesn't really do it justice, but it tells you something about them, I think. And I'm talking about people like John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles. I would say very good examples. Look at their faces. Look at what you see there. You see almost nothing. There's a kind of mask-like quality about these people, an emptiness, very competent people who go about their business, who seem to have no feeling or juice for life. And I would say that these people are often born into families who go back centuries, possibly, in that kind of disconnected condition from life. And while they are able to function very successfully in society and deal with power, because that is their ticket and their coinage, they find that control and destruction of life is the only thing really that gives them life. And since I have read this information that I'll be sharing with you tonight, I'm beginning to come to the conclusion that the people who are involved in the nuclear weapons scenario really want to destroy the world. That is, it isn't a question of, it may seem obvious to say, but they see that as liberation, if you can wrap your mind around that, as a release from what they consider to be an oppressive situation that just simply can't be tolerated. They see destruction as liberation. And so the only thing that would hold them back, I think, from destroying the world is the feeling that they may not have the playground left in which to enact their scenarios of destruction. There would only be one, and that would be the explosion that would take care of the planet. So I would say that this is what we're dealing with. And I would put up as a model against that, on the other side, although this man is not, a messiah by any means, but if you know any of the work of Wilhelm Reich, the psychiatrist who broke away from Freud, he developed an entire psychology around the concept of liberation of energy. Liberation of energy from within the person that was locked up. And it was really the first time, he was the main figure in the history of Western psychology, let's put it that way, which is a recent effort to simply say that we're talking about energy here, and that freedom and the release of free energy from a human being against blocked up channels gives you what's called life. That's life. And of course he was destroyed by the government. He had a device that was an energy accumulator device. He was arrested because a federal agent posing as a buyer or a distributor of that device offered to take it off his hands and bring it through state lines. And so he was served a subpoena to appear before the federal government that involved illegal interstate commerce, and his comment was rather naive. He said, "How can they possibly serve me? That's politics. I'm talking about science." And so he didn't honor the subpoena. They put him in jail and he died. He was talking about fantastical things like plumes of blue energy shooting out of the top of a person into the sky when this kind of liberation of energy would occur. He said that the energy that creates clouds and storms and weather is the same energy that we have inside ourselves. It's identical. And he called the unit of it an orgone. And he invented these wild machines that were able to supposedly maneuver this energy around. I won't go into that in this talk, but he's a fascinating person, and I always hold him up as an example of somebody who ultimately stands for the other side of things, which is life. So the reason that you find some of these fascist lunatics involved with magic and occult sciences and heavy symbology and all of that is because within these secret societies, they are dealing in death as life. If you could imagine life as a kind of hourglass, and they fall through the top into the very skinny part and out the bottom, and they see that as being a form of living, and they take their sensation and their thrills from some sort of upside-down version of life. And I wanted to paint that little sketch before I started because we're going to get into some pretty strange territory here. And I want to say that I think this is basically what's going on. And it's important to know that these people occupied key positions in our government and still do. And they are unaccountable. And it tells you something about what is called a democracy. I've brought some testimony together into this book called U.S. Government Mind Control Experiments on Children. It's a compilation, basically, of testimony that was given in Washington. And before I read from it, while I can still remember, I want to make a few announcements, a little bit about myself and about the people that are here tonight. This is Deep River Books. She Who Remembers is taping this talk. Tape is available afterwards. I'll probably forget to remind you, and Jeannie will stand up and say something. Ralph Cole of Justice Vision is taping, videotaping here. He's also been taping meetings of HEAL, an alternative AIDS group, which is doing some excellent work in bringing some truth about AIDS to people, and he has some of those tapes available too if you'd like to see him. Of course, this book is upstairs at Deep River, and so is another book of mine called AIDS, Inc. that I wrote in 1988. I'm an investigative reporter for about the last 15 years, and I basically have been investigating what I call medical fascism, which I believe is the mechanism by which people are going to be dragged into a brave new world if that is the outcome that we unfortunately end up with. That issue is not decided. But because the medical world has such great authority with people, they believe so much in doctors and experts, they are going to try to make that move. They are going to try to bring people to heal under the aegis of medicine. They are going to try to say that they know science and that therefore you have to listen to what they say. And if they say take a drug or you're suffering from a germ, there is no questioning that. If they say you're detained or quarantined, there's no questioning that. I see that as being something that is, coming around here. Now, this testimony was given before the President's Committee on Radiation in Washington on March 15th, 95. We had 3 people that went up there from New Orleans. Valerie Wolf, a therapist, and 2 of her patients, Claudia Mullen and Christy Nicola. God only knows how they got in and testified. I've heard the story from Valerie. I still don't even believe it, but basically she told the screener up there, the person who was screening applicants to speak, about cruel and unusual radiation experiments on Americans. She said, well, I have patients, and they are saying that some of these doctors who administered radiation administered mind control to them. So we want to talk. And they said, okay. They testified, from what I can gather, for a very short period of time verbally. They submitted a lot of testimony to the committee from other therapists and other patients, and they somehow got in. Nobody knows how, but they got in. And that opens a certain kind of door for us, because it puts it on the record and it gives it a certain legitimacy. And what these patients essentially said was that from the time they were 4 years old, 7 years old, they were tortured by the CIA and the military. You can call it something more sophisticated, but it really isn't. It involved electroshock, physical torture, lights, spinning tables, hallucinogenic drugs, sleep deprivation, isolation tanks, hypnosis, mind programming with commands, layers of trauma that induced buffer zones of amnesia between the traumas and essentially thereby created multiple personalities. Because, as one psychological theory has it, if you induce enough trauma, you get a split in the personality because the person can't face the pain, and so they put that part out of it and they come with a new personality. And if you keep doing it, you invoke or create different personalities, and then if you are the CIA, you try to program these sub-personalities to do different things like memorize information photographically and not remember it, do courier operations, assassination operations, sex agent, blackmail operations, all of this. Now, I must say that I think that some representations of this kind of operation are a little too neat and clean. That is, people assume it's like, okay, we'll create 37 personalities now, we'll program each one, and then we'll enter these commands, and then call it up, and da-da-da-da. I really doubt that it works that way. I think in many cases, it's a total washout. In many cases, it's just psychosis time. Madness. In many cases, some, I don't know, people are killed because they just don't respond and they will not stand for it, no matter what is induced. So, there are two tracks here, and these are the tracks. There is testimony by people saying, this was done to me. Okay? And then you decide if you believe that or not. Then over here, there are attempts to verify through obtaining documents from the CIA and the military that such experiments did in fact go on. To create a parallel track of research to give credence to what these people are saying over here, because, there are many good people who want to say this is all nutcase territory over here. And we don't want to know about it, and frankly, I don't blame them. So the researchers have said, the ones that are really into this, we want to try to document it as well on the other side. And efforts have been made in that direction and continue to be made in that direction. And so let me introduce into the record, and it would be nice if we were all sitting here in front of Arlen Single Bullet Theory Spectre and people like that. Something called Volume 7 of Recent Advances in Biological Psychiatry, the Proceedings of the 19th Annual Convention and Scientific Program of the Society of Biological Psychiatry, Los Angeles, May 1-3, 1964. The officers of this group include Ewan Cameron, M.D., psychiatrist from Canada that many will recognize as possibly the major monster on the planet as far as mind control. Much has been written about him. I'm not going to talk about him much tonight. Now, in Part 1 of the Table of Contents, we have the following paper: Automatic Nervous System Responses in Hospitalized Children Treated with LSD and UML. And one of the researchers is Loretta Bender. Now, Loretta Bender cannot be nailed down as being a CIA employee. She was, in fact, in 1961, a president of the Society of Biological Psychiatry. But she was part of a small group of researchers who were doing early LSD research, most of whom were doing it for the CIA. She attended conferences where those people showed up, like this. And she attended at least one conference by the Josiah Macy Foundation, which was a conduit and front for CIA money. Now, the paper is rather lengthy, but I'm just going to read you a few things from it. This is not part of the book. In the Children's Unit of Creedmoor State Hospital, with a resident population of 450 patients, ages 4 to 15, we have investigated responses of some of these children to lysergic acid and related drugs in the psychiatric, psychological, and biochemical areas. 2 groups of boys receiving daily LSD, UML, which is a methylated derivative of LSD, or psilocybin. At first, the medication was given weekly, but was eventually given daily for periods of up to several months. Okay? And dosages remained constant throughout. LSD 150 mics, which is a standard for an adult trip. Psilocybin 20 milligrams daily, or UML 12 milligrams daily, all given in 2 divided doses. The average duration of treatment was 2 to 3 months daily. children 7, 9, 11 years old. Now, the psychiatrist who sent me this told me that he has a statement at home, which he's going to fax to me, that shows that in several cases, at least with these children, this was carried on for several years daily. Now, of course, all of the testimony here about what happened to the children is they got nothing but better. These were autistic, retarded, a loose term signifying really nothing, but autistic or schizophrenic children. That was the diagnosis. And they all responded, became more straightforward and here and whatever. You decide. Okay? So that is a very significant piece of evidence here. That shows that as early as 1964, the CIA was in fact experimenting, or a person with probable CIA connections was experimenting on young children with LSD and other similar drugs. Okay? You want to turn that light away from me, please? Now I have here a staff memorandum given to me by Harlan Gerard, a very active researcher in this field, to members of the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments from the Advisory Committee staff, June 27, 1994. And this is a summary of the CIA, its history and its activities. So in other words, members of the Committee on Radiation's staff submitted this to the committee at large to kind of clue them in on what the CIA is prior to the 1995 hearings of the President's Committee on Radiation. And they say, in the 1950s and 60s, the CIA engaged in an extensive program of human experimentation using drugs, psychological and other means in search of techniques to control human behavior for counterintelligence and covert action purposes. This is quite an admission. In other words, they're training agents, it says here, by using mind control on them. It doesn't say they're using mind control just to sort of get information from foreign agents. The possibility that the CIA itself engaged in human radiation experiments emanates from references in a 1963 CIA Inspector General's report on Project MKUltra, which was a program concerned with research and development of chemical, biological, and radiological materials capable of employment in clandestine operations to control human behavior. Now, in the rest of this report, they indicate that they cannot find any records of specific radiological experiments carried on by the CIA. And obviously, they are looking. This doesn't look like a total whitewash. But, that doesn't mean you believe them. It just means that those records could be destroyed or hidden away, deep hidden away, because everybody agrees that radiation is a bad thing, and the CIA, last thing they want is for people to believe that they used radiation on people, So, but this does indicate that there was a reference about research and development of radiation by the CIA for purposes of employment in clandestine operations to control human behavior. How the hell do you use radiation in clandestine operations to control human behavior? Well, I would suggest that you use it to traumatize people whom you are training as agents so that you gain control of them and you therefore have them under your thumb and they do what you want them to do. And the testimony here tends to bear that out, that radiation was used on people as a method of inducing trauma, not as a way of testing, does radiation cause harm, which is sort of the gist of the President's Committee on Radiation. They went halfway. They said, terrible things were done to unwitting Americans. Radiation was used by doctors on them in hospitals. But this goes further. We are now talking about a whole other level because those other experiments supposedly were carried on, with a misguided effort to see what toxicity levels were like, unfortunate occurrences, things got out of control at times, isolated individuals did commit crimes, but they were attempting to do medical research. And that's one of those, like, hypnotic phrases, right? I mean, I could probably put everybody to sleep just by sitting here and saying, medical research, medical research, medical research, medical research, medical research. And, like, people would reach into their pocket and come out with money, man, Well, hey, cancer, infantile paralysis, MS, whatever you want, I'll give you money. Medical research, right? That's like what politicians know. That's a key they turn all the time. When they can't figure out what else to say, they say we need more money for research, right? And that means tax money, and it means things that you don't want to be subjected to most of the time. So Valerie Wolf is something else. This woman is down in New Orleans. She's seeing patients that other people won't see. Therefore, they tell strange stories. These are patients that have been fired by other therapists, right? They're very unruly, out of control. They do not recover. Nothing works. They cut themselves. They go into hospitals. They try to commit suicide. They are people that therapists generally flee from. And she says, let's go. That's her scene. So it stands to reason she would hear stories that other therapists tend not to hear. And in her statement to the committee on radiation, March 15th, 95, she says, the research programs, meaning that her patients were submitted to, included radiation, drugs, mind control, and chemicals. My clients and others have reported all of these as being used on them, although technically they were considered to be part of the mind control experiments. Generally, it appears that therapists across the country are finding clients who have been subjected to mind control techniques. The consistency of their stories about the purpose of the mind control and torture techniques, such as electric shock, use of hallucinogens, sensory deprivation, spinning, hypnosis, dislocation of limbs, and sexual abuse is remarkable. There is almost nothing published on this aspect of mind control used with children, and these clients come from all over the country, having had no contact with each other. From the small sample of therapists to whom I talked, it appears that about 25% of the clients report memories of being used in radiation experiments. It is possible that more people were exposed to radiation, but that the memories have not yet emerged because our awareness of this experimentation is so new. Let me say now, before we get into further, that the one organization in the United States that tries to debunk all of this is called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. They are based in Philadelphia. They say that any recovered memories in therapy, that is, any patient who goes into therapy and recovers a memory, is a liar or unintentionally lying because his therapist induced it, suggested it, guided it, okay? Now, I talk to these people, and at certain levels they are very well-meaning. Of course, that's always the way. And I talked to their PR person, and, and she said, I said, well, when were you born, this organization? She said, 1992. I said, well, how extensive is it? She said, we have a chapter in every state. Now, for anybody who's ever been an activist or worked in a nonprofit 501c3, are you kidding me, man? You've got a chapter in every state in 3 years? You're cooking. You are cooking. And in foreign countries they have chapters too. But no foundation money and no government funding. This is like, they're like walking on water, What? Yeah, it took McDonald's longer, right? So, there we go, right? That's the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Individual contributions. Now, the deal is, it is true. Now, that organization was founded by Pamela Fried. Her daughter accused her and or her husband, I'm not sure of the exact circumstances, of abuse as a child, see. And in the resultant uproar, they founded this organization. And Frontline on PBS did an entire episode on all of this. And then received a letter from, I think it was the daughter's brother, who said, you know, that was quite a presentation you put on about the false memory syndrome and my mother, and I just wanted to tell you, though, that despite your sympathetic treatment of this organization, everything my sister said is absolutely true, and they were abusing her from the time she was a little kid. Right, so that's, you know, interesting about the beginning of this organization. Now, on the board of the organization, we have such luminaries as Louis Jolly West. Louis Jolly West, who, Louis, I never worked for the CIA, Jolly West. You know, this guy's been documented to do all kinds of stuff for the CIA and military on mind control stuff. Gave LSD to an elephant, killed an elephant. Wanted to start the Center for the Study of Violence at UCLA in the 1970s. We have letters, and this was going to be located at a used, abandoned Nike missile base somewhere out north of LA, and part of the deal was they were going to do psychosurgery on violent offenders, which is the selective melting of brain connections to keep people from being violent. And this was touted as heavily medical, very precise. This is right in the ballpark of what I'm talking about here when they say it's all medical. This is like, you know, we've miniaturized it. And we can just take out, you know, a certain number of neurons here and there, and everything's cool. And some people throw up their hands and they say, well, who am I to, you know, I don't know, maybe they're right. Right? Bad mistake. Peter Bregan, a psychiatrist who investigates toxic drugs and violence projects against citizens using psychiatry as a front. He's a psychiatrist who, you know, lays it on psychiatrists. He discovered that the one case that they claim was really cured by psychosurgery was turned into a gibbering lunatic. And that's why he was cured of violence, because he wasn't able to even live unless somebody was taking care of him all the time. And this particular patient was heralded as a cure by Frank Irvin and Vernon Sweet and these guys in the 70s who were the doctors doing psychosurgery. That was their model showcase cure, you know, of violence. So Louis West, this guy who wanted to start this center at UCLA, he is on the board of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and so is Martin Orne, a Harvard psychiatrist who has done contract work for the CIA in the past, and several other people who have those kind of connections. Right? So that tells you something else right away. They want to debunk this stuff like right out of that box. Forget it. And this is the kind of stuff they want to debunk. Claudia Mullen, patient of Valerie Wolf, report to the Presidential Commission on Radiation. Between the years of 1957 and 1984, I became a pawn in a government scheme whose ultimate goal was mind control and to create the perfect spy. All through the use of chemicals, radiation, drugs, hypnosis, electric shock, isolation in tubs of water, sleep deprivation, brainwashing, and verbal, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. I was exploited unwittingly for nearly 3 decades of my life, and the only explanations given to me were that the end justifies the means, and I was serving my country in their bold effort to fight communism. I can only summarize my circumstances by saying they took an already abused 7-year-old child and compounded my suffering beyond belief. In 1958, I was to be tested, they told me, by some important doctors coming from a place called the Society. That's the Human Ecology Society, a known CIA front. I was told to cooperate, answer any of their questions. Then, since the test might hurt, I would be given shots, x-rays, and a few jolts of electricity. I was also instructed not to look at anyone's face too hard and to ignore names. as this was a very secret project, but to be brave and all those things would help me forget. Naturally, as most children do, I did the opposite and remembered as much as I could. A Dr. John Gittinger, I'll mention who these people were in case you don't know, and I have to tell you, these people in this testimony named names. They did not screw around. A Dr. John Gittinger tested me, and Dr. Cameron gave me the shocks, and Dr. Green the x-rays. Then I was told by Sid Gottlieb I was ripe for the big A, meaning artichoke. Okay. By the time I left to go home, just like every time from then, I would recall nothing of my tests or the different doctors. I would only remember whatever explanations Dr. Robert G. Heath of Tulane Medical School gave me for the odd bruises, needle marks, burns on my head and fingers, and even the genital soreness. I had no reason to believe otherwise. Already they had begun to control my mind. The next year I was sent to a place in Maryland called Deep Creek Cabins to learn how to sexually please men. I was taught how to coerce them into talking about themselves. It was Richard Helms, Deputy Director of the CIA, Dr. Gottlieb, Captain George White, and Morse Allen, who all planned on filming as many high government and agency officials and heads of academic institutions and foundations as possible. So later, when the funding for mind control and radiation started to dwindle, then the projects would continue at any cost, in other words, blackmail. I was to become a regular little spy for them after that summer, eventually entrapping many unwitting men, including themselves, all with the use of a hidden camera. I was only 9 when this kind of sexual humiliation began. I overheard conversations about a part of the agency called ORD, run by Dr. Green, Dr. Stephen Aldrich, Martin Orne, and Morse Allen, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Dr. John Gittinger was Sid Gottlieb's protege. Gittinger tested everybody. He was like a fanatical tester, developing profiles of humans, different types of humans, all kinds of questionnaire-type testing. Sid Gottlieb was the head of MKUltra project for the CIA, a very high-ranking bureaucrat, probably never treated a patient in his life. See, now these people are saying that these guys were doing it. They were not supervising it alone. They were doing it. Dr. Green seems to be a name that is a cover name that many different people used. However, there was an L. Wilson Green, technical director of U.S. Army Chemical and Radiological Laboratories at the Army Chemical Center. So we could have both things happening there. Richard Helms became director of the CIA, a real smooth operator. He was the person who destroyed many MKUltra files before they could be revealed. Captain George White made a statement to the effect of, nowhere else but in the CIA could a young red-blooded American rape, pillage, and plunder without, accountability. He set up a brothel in San Francisco in the 60s, paid off prostitutes to bring in Johns into a room which he was filming, and these Johns unwittingly drank LSD in their cocktails. And the filming supposedly was to determine, what the effects of LSD were on unwitting subjects. This is documented up and down. By the way, for those of you that want to get the background here, John Marks, Search for the Manchurian Candidate, Walter Boart, Operation Mind Control, now updated. It's upstairs. So is John Marks' book, I'm sure. In fact, it is. And there's a very difficult book to find called The Mind Manipulators by Alan Shefflin, which goes into a wider arena and is a very valuable reference source. And there are many other books, Journey into Madness. But the Marx book, the Shefflin book, and the Boart book all took off from the same revelation of the 10 or so boxes of information that were finally released by the CIA in about 1977, that were actually financial records of MKUltra. They didn't think they were very incriminating, but when you finally began to look at them, you saw that they were very incriminating. A mistake. Okay, so let's, that was George White. His name was mentioned here. Then we had Morse Allen, who was the head of Project Bluebird, another mind control project. High up people here she's talking about, who planned on filming as many high government and agency officials and Stephen, she says, I overheard conversations about a part of the agency called ORD, Office of Research and Development, run by Dr. Green, Dr. Stephen Aldrich, who became director of ORD, researched remote control of brains by electrodes, went to the college that I went to, Amherst College. Hope I run into him sometime. Martin Orne, mentioned again. So we're not stinting here on names. These people just named them. They're sitting here in a room in Washington, D.C., before the President's Committee on Radiation saying that Richard Helms was involved in torture and brainwashing. Now, Valerie Wolf makes this comment about Claudia Mullen. After 9 months of therapy, she came to therapy one day with MKUltra written with other words on a piece of paper. First time. Had never mentioned any of this before. From that point on, she began to work on the mind control issues and began to improve. All of her memories have emerged spontaneously without the use of memory enhancement techniques such as hypnosis or sodium amytal. I had told her nothing about government and CIA research projects. To the best of my knowledge, she has read nothing about mind control or CIA covert operations. Since she decided to listen carefully and remember as much as she could about conversations among the researchers, her memories are extraordinarily complete. I have sent written copies of memories to Dr. Alan Shefflin for validation, the author of Mind Manipulators, who's a professor at law at University at Santa Clara. Dr. Alan Shefflin for validation, and he has confirmed that she has knowledge of events and people that are not published anywhere, that some of her memories contain new information and that some are already known and published. Some of her memories have been confirmed by family members. She has also shown me old scrapbooks where she wrote notes to remember what was happening to her and hid the notes under the pictures in the scrapbook. Claudia Mullen states that she is still being monitored, that there is a doctor who is in New Orleans who was the family doctor. She names him in her longer testimony and asks me, well, she didn't say don't name him, but she said something like, don't tell him you're going to do something before you do it. Just do it. Apparently, as recently as a month or two ago, she feels that it's a strange situation. Apparently, she was not positive that this doctor was monitoring her, but now she is. She went to his office. She doesn't remember what happened to her, but there were marks on her when she left the office, and she feels that he is still monitoring her. So there is an element of danger involved in this by these people, and some of these statements in here are anonymous. Some therapists make statements anonymously because there is public censure by their peers for getting into this stuff. I'm told that a therapist named Corey Hammond, who spoke at a recent convention on methods of deprogramming this kind of mind control that he has developed, Valerie Wolf says she's using these and they're terrific. They work. that he has been subject to a lot of censure by his, whatever, psychologists, other psychologists, societies, whatever it is, and that he doesn't want to talk to people anymore. Just for making a verbal presentation at this conference. Okay? All right. Christy Nicola, another patient of Valerie Wolf. Tucson, Arizona. I was taught how to pick locks, be secretive, use my photographic memory. Dr. Green taught me a technique to withhold information by repeating numbers to myself. He would show me information, then shock me. That means electroshock. I would repeat the numbers in my head. I refused to disclose the information that he just gave her, and he found me to be very successful in that part of his mind control experiment. I was 4 years old. He moved on to wanting me to kill dolls that looked like real children. I stabbed a doll with a spear once after being severely tortured, but the next time I refused. Dr. Green used many torture techniques, but as I got older, I resisted more and more. He often tied me down in a cage near his office. Between 1972 and 76, he and his assistants were sometimes careless and left the cage unlocked. It was at these times I snuck into his office and found files with reports and memos addressed to CIA and military personnel. Included in these files were program, project, subproject, subject, and experiment names with some code numbers for radiation and mind control experiments. I was caught twice, and Dr. Green tortured me ruthlessly with electric shock, drugs, spinning me on a table, putting shots in my stomach and my back, dislocating my joints, and hypnotic techniques to make me feel crazy and suicidal. Because of my rebellion and growing lack of cooperation, they gave up on me as a spy assassin. Consequently, the last 2 years, 1974 to 76, Dr. Green had access to me. He used various mind control techniques to reverse the spy assassin messages to self-destruct and death messages if I ever remembered anything. His purpose? He wanted me dead, and I have struggled to stay alive all of my adult life. I believe that it is truly by the grace of God that I am still alive. That's just a piece of her testimony. Statement from Alan Shefflin, lawyer, professor of law, Santa Clara. Claudia's therapist, Claudia Mullen, that's Valerie Wolf he's talking about, has been kind enough to send me, with her patient's informed consent, some of the pertinent records reflecting Claudia's memories of her experiences as an unwitting subject in these experiments. I have been able to confirm that some of the information Claudia has provided is absolutely true and could not have been derived from any published source. I spoke with Shefflin, and he said to me, well, I thought he was playing it maybe a little close to the vest. I understand he's writing a book on this, I don't know. But he said, there is one piece of information, definitely, I was able to confirm, and I don't know how she could possibly have known this. It involves the connection between two government researchers that is not published anywhere. And he said, I just happen to know that they are connected, and she mentioned that they knew each other. Pretty startling stuff. Okay, I'll get back to this. Let me just comment on some of this here. All throughout this testimony, you have other patients who are saying similar things. Dr. Green, Dr. Green, Dr. Green, Dr. Green. Electroshock, torture, sex abuse, and all of that. About 3 weeks ago, I met a woman who's a therapist. She works north of Los Angeles. If you met this woman and talked to her, you would say, she's very on top of things, she's very smart, she seems like a real human being. So she looks at me and she says, I was part of this when I was a kid, as a child. She doesn't want to talk about it yet, but she said to me, this business about creating perfect spies, she says, I don't think that's it. I don't think that's why they were really doing it. Because, you see, part of the explanation of what they were supposedly trying to do here was create blank slate. That was their thinking. We can take a human being and erase their mind, then we can program it to be whatever we want it to be. Well, adults just go psychotic So let's try children. They're more flexible, and they have less in their mind to take out. How mechanistic can you get? And that was the rationale, supposedly. Now, from that, it has been assumed that the whole point of this was to create a perfect spy with nice, neat categories of subpersonalities and program and trigger words, Manchurian candidate type stuff. We'll now call up subpersonality 34. Are you there? Yes, I am here. What have you learned on your recent trip to Vienna? Start. Bing. And then subpersonality 134 says, I boarded the train at da-da-da, and I went to Vienna, and I've read the following documents that were given to me like a computer, see. That this was the intention. But this woman said to me, she was sort of saying, yeah, but I think there's something beyond this. And I said, well, what do you think it is? So she said, quite frankly, she said, it's somewhere in the back of my mind, but I can't get to it. So I said, well, she said, look, and, I didn't question her about how she knows this, but she said to me, first of all, she said this was very wide-ranging, this project. There were echelons of the project, she said, not just simply one level. She said there were children brought up from South America and Mexico. She said they were considered expendable. They were used with the crudest techniques of brainwashing and so forth. She said the idea was to learn from this techniques in a more refined way that would be used on another echelon of children. I said, which is what? She said, the best and brightest in America. I said, you mean children from very well-to-do families? She said, not necessarily, the smartest. I said, well, in that case, they could be thinking that what they want to do is program these kids who would later supposedly emerge in prominent positions in society, so that then they would have long-term control of the society by controlling people in power positions. And she said, she didn't say yes, but she said, yeah, that makes sense. Right? So she said, the Nazis got a hold of the intelligentsia. They turned the intelligentsia. That was one of their first victories. They were able to either silence or bring the intelligentsia into their fold. So it was a major project, and she said to me, they brought a lot of doctors over here after the war, and not just the rocket scientists, they brought a lot of doctors over here. And all throughout this testimony, you will read sprinkled here, doctors with German accent. Was it Green? Was it a Greenberg, a German Jew, but he didn't look like a Jew, he had blonde hair, and da-da-da-da, and whatever. That kind of stuff. So, I would say this is a Nazi project, but a lot of the Nazis are American-born. I want to continue, get to the end, we'll do questions later. But it shouldn't be excused or explained away on that basis. Because, as we know, if we look at Nazi psychiatry, for example, they learned a lot from the Americans, especially about eugenics. So, this is not something you just say, well, the Nazis took over. No, this is homegrown stuff. This is Americana at its worst, at its lowest form. This is also what I would say, you could say this is the sub-basement that you walk into when you are a materialist, when that is your philosophy. And I don't mean that you just simply are a materialist in the sense that you want money, possessions. I mean philosophically. The materialist position is that we are meat and tissue and cells and electrical impulses, and that's it. And when that system collapses, we're gone, never to return. And my own feeling is that when you espouse and embrace that philosophy, the ultimate sub-basement that you end up in is that sub-basement. That's where you end up. Finally, that's where it all comes out. And I must say, even though I admire many of the researchers on psychedelics and feel that they are basically liberating types of people, I think some of them make a mistake when they start talking about, well, it's all chemicals anyway. What difference does it make? You know, we're only dealing with chemical reactions anyway, so what's this nonsense about consciousness separate from chemicals? And they're using that, of course, to say, which is understandable, why is the government trying to outlaw the use of psychedelics if, in fact, all consciousness is chemical anyway? They're just being selective in their choices of chemical. You know, they're saying alcohol, yes, and LSD, no. But I think that these people have a little bit to think about in this one area. I'm not trying to put them down at all. In fact, I admire them. But I think when they start talking about, well, consciousness is just chemicals anyway. No, I'm afraid I'd have to disagree with that. I think that it's a lot more than chemicals. You can certainly make people do very bizarre things with chemicals, and you can make them suffer a great deal because we are in these bodies here. But it's a lot more than that. So that's where I think you wind up. You wind up with this crazy idea about programming people. That's where I think you end up with this stuff. Now, on the plus side, if we know this, if we understand what's happening here, and therapists can be brought into this whole dialogue, then we are talking about bridging something that's very un-middle class into the middle class and into people who normally don't consider these kinds of things, because we're talking therapists here. Private practice therapists who are sitting there and patients come into their office and say, I was part of CIA mind control. Now, I'm not saying that the middle class is, you know, this fabulous entity that we have to somehow court, but I am saying that this is an issue which can get some people involved that normally do not get involved, and if they are so willing, they can create some havoc with the government. And that's my next point here. One of the reasons that I am going into this and getting involved in it is because I want people to begin to see the government for what it actually is. And I think that this is a way of doing that. Unequivocally coming to it. People who say, the government, yes, and if we just get the more right people in, and a little more funding, more research, and more funding for research, and more this, you know, more that, everything's going to work out, and we get the nice guys, and elect Bill and don't elect George, and elect Jim and don't elect Phil, and, you know, and it's all this kind of whipsawing stuff that I see every time an election comes around, you know. Oh, we got to vote for Bill because if we don't, we'll get George, and this and that, and, you know, and more money for research, and if they'd only, you know, bop. You know, and it's like a vice that people are in, and everybody knows it. So, I have a statement here from Colin Ross, a very interesting man. Never heard of him before. He's a psychiatrist in Richardson, Texas. He's been researching the CIA for 20 years. Every time a MK-Ultra type researcher dies, he sends away Freedom of Information Act requests. Because he figures, well, the guy's dead, they'll be more likely to release the documents now. And he's very cute with this. He accumulates little this, little of that. MK-Ultra had about 139 to 150 sub-projects. Nobody knows what they all were, or even if that's the total. That's the basic mind control project of the CIA after the Second World War. And he has files on as many of these as he can possibly get. Okay? I have in my possession about 80 of the 149 sub-project files which I obtained through Freedom of Information Act, filing requests with the CIA on each deceased investigator of interest. I like that. So he says, neurosurgeons at Tulane, Yale, and Harvard did extensive research on brain electrode implants with intelligence funding and combined brain implants with large numbers of drugs, including hallucinogens. So while they're telling Tim Leary and Richard Alpert to get out of Harvard, because a few people are taking acid and enjoying it, there's other people there who are inserting electrodes in people's brains and then giving them acid. MKUltra alone included 4 sub-projects on children. One was conducted at the International Children's Summer Camp in Maine by an unwitting investigator. The MKUltra sub-project file in my possession for this project states that the CIA's interest in this research was in establishing contact with foreign nationals of potential future operational use by the CIA. The children who served as subjects in the project were as young as 11 years old. Multiple personality patients in treatment throughout the United States and Canada are describing involvement in mind control research that is much more sophisticated than MKUltra. Deliberate sexual abuse of children to make them more dissociative. And then he ends up simply by saying, I would be pleased to testify at length at any hearings on CIA and military mind control. Colin Ross, M.D., psychiatrist, Richardson, Texas. Here's a statement from a therapist submitted anonymously. This is a therapist, anonymously says, one client told me that they were made to believe they had been abducted by UFOs, so that if memories were retrieved, they would be discredited by the community. I found that kind of interesting. And other people mention satanic costumes, putting on satanic costumes CIA people did while they were doing, their crazy stuff here. Here's John Boyd, Ph.D., clinical psychologist, practiced psychotherapy for 25 years, Ohio State, University of Virginia. I've treated 3 patients whose memories of childhood abuse include the detailed recall of sophisticated mind control technology being inflicted upon them by, quote, experts in collusion with the patient's mentally disturbed parents. The independent reports of these individuals contain similar information of an esoteric and intricate nature concerning mind control technology, which, in my opinion, could be gained only through personal experience. The press says nothing. The press says 0 about this. Here's a woman operating under the pseudonym, I believe, of Chandra Walker Michaels. I learned how to handle weapons, particularly how an ice pick left a neat hole. A hole that allowed so little blood to escape that the victim could remain in public view for hours before they would be discovered not to be napping. I was taken on planes to Germany and Egypt to assist Joe with arson, to Israel alone with messages, to Mexico for terrorist activities. I remember a small laboratory in a partially exposed basement of a large building I visited many times, starting at age 4, south of Washington, D.C. At the age of 14, I was drugged and woke up on a stretcher. I heard men outside my door discussing how they had gotten me past the guards at Langley that night. At the age of 15, Joe introduced me to an elderly man he referred to as the Senator. At the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., the portly gentleman was brought to a room adjoining ours. Our closest space was filled with photographic equipment viewing the Senator's scene. I refused to participate. I was severely punished. Now, just a word about the media, and then we'll take a break. One of the best payoffs of being a reporter for 15 years is that I've come to see this machine called the media and how it operates in a way that I never thought was possible. Because I've talked to a lot of reporters, and they become the eyes and the mouth and the ears for everybody else. And since I'm now researching the Oklahoma City bombing, and I've done a lot of research on AIDS, and now this and other topics, there's a pattern that always seems to emerge. And the pattern is that there is a cover story that emerges very quickly after something either is revealed or it happens. Very quickly, a cover story comes to the fore. And then anything that does not fit the cover story is discarded. In the case of Oklahoma City, it happens to be, basically that McVeigh is a redneck. McVeigh and a few of his friends are rednecks. The rednecks are connected to other rednecks that belong to militias, and the militias blew up the building, and that's it. We don't want to know anything else. They're all kind of crazy and stupid. And that's the end of the story. They rented a Ryder truck, knowing it could be traced. They bought 5,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate, knowing it could be traced, Hey, business is suddenly picking up. Did you see this guy who came in and bought 5,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate? Wow. I thought business was kind of slow, and then all of a sudden, they came in like, 15 or 20 cars, and they loaded it up and back to the station wagon, and they kept coming back for more, and they took it away, I guess April is a really good planting month, they're really, they got a lot of crops in mind here, And that's the cover, right? And people are, they were that stupid, and that's all we have to know about it. And McVeigh, 3 hours after the explosion, happens to be driving in a car without a license. And a cop stops him, and he says, I have to cite you for driving without a license. You'll have to appear. And McVeigh says, no problem. And then the officer looks at him and he says, she's writing out the citation. Right, he's going to give it to him and let him drive away. No problem. Driving without a license, so what? You just appear, and then he keeps looking, he keeps writing. He says, sir, do you have something under your windbreaker there? And McVeigh says, I have a weapon under my windbreaker. Pulls down a zipper, opens up the windbreaker. There is a 9mm Glock, a 5-inch knife hanging off of his belt. He's just killed, 100 people, whatever. He's on a lonely road someplace with a 9mm. Cop stops him. He's going to let him go. He says he has a weapon. The cop then puts the service revolver to his head, disarms him, takes him to jail, puts him on ice for a few days until the feds say, they work fast, these guys. 3 days, they know who did it, they know what happened. They come to the jail where he is and they take him, right? By the way, I was told that initial reports placed McVeigh at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma. One of the people who anonymously testifies in here, and has been mentioned by other people, says some of the mind control work was done on them at Tinker Air Force Base, right? Tinkerbell, right? So, this is the scenario that's painted by the press, see? Now, we talk about mind control here. Right? Now, the reporters that I talk to, this is the part that I'm talking about, the media, because the rest of this we know about. But the reporters, how they slip and slide with this once the cover story is established. How they manage to keep from discovering anything or thinking about anything, or just considering the insanity of the cover story itself, is really something to behold. And I've been talking to a bunch of reporters down in Oklahoma City now. And I just listen and we talk, and it's all very chatty and everything. And for example, one guy who is this guy's on the Daily Oklahoman, which is the only paper in Oklahoma City, by the way. There's only one. And all he can talk about is the federal boys. The federal boys combing through the wreckage of the building. The federal boys. The federal boys were there, and they did this, and they told me, and the federal boys said this. And it's kind of like, when a sports writer covers the Yankees, right? The slugger told me this, and he told me that he throws a curveball, man. He holds it this way, see? And this is how he does it. It's fantastic, I went out had a beer with Mickey, that kind of stuff. The federal boys told me that they couldn't find any other kind of bomb in the building at all. You know, and like that's it. What else is there to know? You know, the federal boys day after day were going through the wreckage and they told him that they couldn't find anything. And he, you know, and this guy would have talked for 3 hours about this if I let him. And that's how he keeps himself from figuring out what's going on. And each reporter has his own little scene. Right? And in the case of this one here, of course, now Valerie Wolfen and one of her patients, you know, they say, look, we're not so sure we want to really get this exposed all the way out because we know that the False Memory Syndrome Foundation right now has a stranglehold on the press. That's the cover story, see? And nobody cares that the board is composed of these guys with CIA, you know, mind control connections. That's the cover story that's laid down, and so everything else is irrelevant. So that's what we have to bust, is that cover story. With enough people coming forward saying, it's not true.